Thanks a lot. Well, we'll introduce ourselves really quickly. It's really great to be here. So my name is Marshall Burke. I am a co-founder of Atlas AI, and my day job is actually as on the faculty at Stanford. I'm an economist by training. So Karen Burns and I, Karen is our director of partnerships at Atlas. We'll tag team here briefly and would just love to fill you in on the work we're trying to do at Atlas AI using geospatial information, particularly information from satellites, to try to make measurements of key economic indicators on the ground. And what I'm going to show you today is really based on years of research we've been doing at Stanford. And then at Atlas, we've really been trying to scale it up and make these measurements useful for folks like you in the world who are out there trying to do evaluations around the world at scale, and so we would love your feedback on what we've built. Okay, so next slide. Okay, so our mission at Atlas is it's monitoring the drivers of economic development around the world, and we do that in a couple different ways, which I'll show you. And really with the hope of not just measuring things, but unlocking the sorts of capital flows that we want to see and helping direct those flows to places where returns are high, right? Again, with the goal of advancing livelihoods, improving livelihoods throughout the world. Next slide. So as we know, monitoring key economic outcomes can be pretty difficult in many parts of the world using the data we have on hand. So here is a plot from a paper we published 6 months ago showing in the map how many years pass between nationally representative wealth or consumption expenditure surveys. And these are data from the DHS and the data reported on PopCal, a resource you guys know well. As you can see, in many countries, this interval has come down. Actually, it's countries are doing surveys every 1 to 2 years, nationally representative consumption surveys. But in other places, it's much more infrequent, right? We can go half a decade, up to a decade, even longer before we get a nationally representative consumption expenditure survey. And that's difficult, again, if we want to do many of the monitoring and evaluation tasks that we care about. Since I'm going to show you some satellite data, and we often think about satellites in terms of revisit rate, how often does a satellite pass over? We can calculate that same number for the household surveys. And I've done that here for economic surveys in the US and economic surveys in Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, this is a little bit silly. For a lot of these outcomes, we're after national statistics. We're not after household statistics. We know how to draw samples and take averages. But just sort of to think about how infrequent individual households get sampled, here are the statistics on that. So for the average African household, it's going to take them about 1,000 years to show up in a household survey at current survey frequency. It's a little bit better in the US. You'll get there every 50 years or so. But individual households, very local level economic information is collected very infrequently. Okay, next slide. Compare that to what we get now from satellites, right? So, and especially in the last 3 to 5 years, the landscape of the amount of data being collected by satellites has fundamentally changed. So here you can see the revisit interval, and multiple satellites give us cloud-free images up to every week, or for planet every day. This is a cloud-free image of every place on the Earth every single day. And so our goal at Atlas, well, originally at Stanford on the research side, now at Atlas, once we've convinced ourselves this actually works, is to understand, all right, can we use this fire hose of information that we're getting from satellites to help fill in these gaps, the gaps in between surveys, either spatially or temporally. And that's been our goal. So next slide. And what we've shown, again, through years of research, and happy to go into the details on that, is that these new sources of data from satellites can make accurate, inexpensive measurements at scale of key economic indicators. So here is one of the things we measure. This is asset wealth. It's a measure of households' ownership of assets. This is actually a measure derived from the Demographic and Health Surveys, a nice set of surveys that are geo-referenced across large geographies. So give us a lot of training data to train these models. And we've shown in multiple papers that you can, even in countries where the model has not been trained, you can make very accurate predictions of asset wealth at the village scale, right? So once you've convinced yourself the model works, because we have imagery everywhere, you can then rapidly scale this up. And you can do it back through time, because for many of the sensors, we have information that goes back decades, right? So here's a map of asset wealth across sub-Saharan Africa, and the more red colors are wealthier areas, the blue colors are darker areas. And this isn't interactive, but we could zoom in on any of these and get a much more granular look. Next slide, please. But so for us, the power of this information comes not just from having one of these measurements, but having many different measurements across many different verticals or domains. So we have the wealth measurements, another thing that we've worked on with Talib, actually a lot, who he's going to talk about in a moment, is measurements of agricultural productivity. And again, working with Talib and his great team, we've convinced ourselves satellites can do a pretty darn good job of field scale measurement of agricultural productivity. So incredibly granular sub-village scale measurements. And again, once you have that, then you can expand them across all agricultural growing areas and make these accurate measurements. We also care about where people are. So us and others have worked on population scale estimates. You can combine that. Infrastructure is another huge area of interest. And really our working hypothesis is that the power of these data really come when you can overlay all of these different layers and use them as a sense-making tool, either for monitoring given outcomes or for evaluation of the sort that you do. Okay, next slide, and I think I'll turn it over to Karen here.
Perfect. Thank you, Marshall. Hi, everybody. And okay, so continuing this thread, so like Marshall mentioned, we see the possibility of all of these indicators in the aggregate, and that's what we're really excited about, kind of looking forward. But looking backwards, I want to walk everybody through a couple case studies of work that we've done that have really focused on these work in their individual silos. So next slide, please. So one of a really interesting project that we did in collaboration with World Bank Ethiopia, and this was really leaning on like a long-term relationship that Marshall and team had with Lucy and Pop, and doing work in that wealth estimate bucket. So we worked with the teams to do remote sensing for poverty estimation in Ethiopia. And this is a really interesting analysis because, like Marshall said, most of our kind of core technologies are based on DHS and LSMS studies, but in this study, we actually incorporated additional data assets to bolster these findings and really get to the point. And we worked very closely with the teams to, it was basically like a combination of research and practical study to get to a point where we produced poverty estimates that the team were comfortable enough with that they actually incorporated into their programming and used to benchmark and integrate into statistics throughout the duration of the project. So if you have questions about that project, please put them in the chat because Marshall and team worked really closely on that for several years. Next slide. And this project, this is something that we just wrapped up in the last couple of months. So this is something that falls in our agriculture bucket. So starting in right at the beginning of COVID, so right at late March, early April, in Kenya, where we have a lot of partnerships and we're trying to get more ingrained into efforts with AGRA and the government of Kenya, particularly the Ministry of Agriculture. Maybe some folks here on the call were part of these efforts as well. So the Ministry of Agriculture launched an effort called the Food Security War Room, which was really trying to pull everybody in like the gigantic agriculture ecosystem together to deal with the duality of COVID and locust infestations in Kenya. And so what we contributed as part of this effort was that we did 2016 through 2019 maize yield estimates. So they were looking for historical estimates to basically complement official statistics, but help people grasp really the extent of this problem. And this was a really interesting exercise for us to go through because what it came down to was that this really highlighted a lot of some of the challenges that go with geospatial data. And that when we had essentially shown already proof of concept with 1 acre fund data, working in specific regions of Kenya to do maize yield estimates. But when we tried to scale those efforts to look nationally first, we realized that we didn't have the right sample frame set up from the beginning. And so we were able to get some good estimates for basically a quarter of the country where we had good 1 acre fund data. But this was a really important learning experience for us because it became evident that the lack of available training and validation data, and in this case, that's crop cuts collected specifically for the purpose of creating maize yield estimates at the subnational and national levels, was really an inhibitor to doing the broad scale kind of calculation that we know our technology is capable of. So we hope to continue to actually work really closely with the Ministry of Ag, and as well as this, there's this small little parastatal group called CalRO that's really being, actually with World Bank support, being capacitated to try to be a hub for all of these data collection efforts that will allow the government to leverage technologies like ours. Next slide, please. And then this is this third use case that I'm actually going to buzz real quick because this is work that we're doing really closely with TALIP and in the 50 by 2030 initiative. So I'm just going to pause this because you'll hear more about this later. And then finally, next slide. Thank you. And then the one other vertical, actually one of the other four verticals that Marshall mentioned earlier was this infrastructure vertical. And this is something that's, it's emergent, it's new, it's something that we're particularly excited about. And right now we're getting pretty good at electricity infrastructure, like the presence or absence of electrification. You can see here the 450 meter per pixel granularity. And what our teams are working really hard on right now is trying to understand if the same technologies can be applied to estimate consumption and reliability. And again, where I think the power of our technologies come is that we're really good at doing things at scale. So able to, once we kind of perfect and refine this, it gives ability to look at, and right now, electrification. Fortunately, going forward, we have all kinds of ideas about other types of infrastructure, but looking broad across some large swaths of geography. And next slide, please. Okay, so this brings us to why we're here today and talking to this group. And in particular, this is the stuff that gets me most excited of the work here at Atlas. So at Atlas, my function is a partnerships role, so working with a lot of our collaborators across IOs, bilaterals, government agencies, nonprofits, but my background's in evaluation. So most recently, I came from Deloitte Consulting, and I was part of our Evaluation Program Center of Excellence, and I spent the last several years working on large-scale evaluations in the health sector in particular, working with ministries of health, looking at healthcare finance reform. So, and also working really closely with the Department of State and doing their managing evaluation and training. So this is actually part of the reason that I joined Atlas, because I think that these technologies have a lot of, there's so much potential to integrate these into the M&E space. So this is what we'd love to hear from this group as well, because we know you guys are experts in this as well. So this, we just want to walk you a little bit through some of our preliminary thinking of what the future could look like. So first, what we feel that we're going to be really good at doing right now, and then blending a little bit into the short term, because we have some refinements on this to do, is what you see in the left-hand side of this, but under these buckets of program targeting and monitoring. So in program targeting, there's really interesting potential to help leverage this technology, again, over large geographies and large sets of information, especially when we start thinking about how we integrate all of this data to create unique insights, to look at unmet need in a different way. So starting to say, what are these things in combination that allow us to identify areas that may be in need for intervention that we haven't thought of before? And then kind of on a similar vein, we're very interested in starting to think of how we can combine all of our different verticals of wealth, agriculture, and infrastructure and population to start getting a better sense of, in combination with unmet need, where programs may be placed that have a higher likelihood of success for a variety of reasons. And then the second thing that we're really interested in that we think we can do really well in the short term is this program monitoring. So we know that we can track these things over time, and it does depend on, the cadence does depend on the particular technologies. So some of them can be snapshotted in an annual way. Some of them can be like going with growing cycles, for example. So we want to get better and better at refining that so we can start to see just a quicker turn on these types of outputs. And then also being able to provide interim assessments to official estimates, both population and economic markers. We know that these things come out at different time periods, and people are always looking for reliable, robust measures that can be integrated into decision-making in between those efforts. And then finally, you can read what we have here on the right, but this is what we basically see in the future. If we want to do additional research to understand if our technologies can be used to supplement and complement some work in survey design and sample frames, as well as mid and end term evaluation standpoints where we can start to extract information, especially in data sparse environments. And I think that's it. We'd love to questions from the group. Really, we want this to be iterative and hear from folks.
Great. Joanna, if you could just stop sharing your screen, that way we can see the presenters. Yes, perfect. Thank you. So you have lots of questions because our staff is very interested and have used before this tool. So I'm sure there will be a very lively discussion. Just to remind everyone, we will have another Q&A after Talib and Raghavan present as well. So this is not the last opportunity we're hearing from each other. But just to start us off, and again, we have lots of questions. I'm going to try to combine some, but also go in the order they came. If we get confused or need a little bit more background, I'll ask the people to sort of chime in by speaking up. So we have a couple of questions about how you determine productivity apart from observations of greening, inverse vegetation cover. This came from Lauren Kelly. She also wanted you to maybe touch upon the cost for obtaining this imagery.
Sure, I can take that. Yeah, so on the agricultural side, we really go crop by crop, and so there you need sort of two models. One, you need to be able to tell from imagery what crop is being grown. So really in sub-Saharan Africa, we focus mainly on maize, as that's the main crop grown, one of the main crops grown throughout the continent. So you need a model that tells you whether something is maize or not maize. And then once you've decided it's maize or been convinced it's maize, then you need a model to tell you how productive the maize is. And those are actually two separate models. Again, happy to go into the details. They do use types of vegetation indices that are really tailored to the local agronomy. And again, the way we convince ourselves that these work is we train a model on some data and then we evaluate it on data that it wasn't trained on, right? This is the hardest test of a model. And if it performs well in that setting, then you're convinced that it's making a good measurement. And again, we do that on the agricultural side, we do that on the wealth side. Pretty much any of these estimates I'm showing you, we'll do this out of sample testing to make sure the model's actually doing, performing well.
Perfect. And just to continue with the question from Lauren that came a little bit later, but how long does a trend line for smaller satellite images? How long is it, especially for the same location?
Thanks, Lauren. Not totally sure what you mean by smaller there. So maybe you probably mean the sensor, the pixel resolution. So we have Landsat imagery, which is 30-meter pixels that goes back to the 80s or 90s. The very high resolution stuff goes back to the early 2000s, but the overpass interval is much slower. So if you're lucky in some locations, you might get one image per year. That's enough for some applications that you care about. It's not going to be enough for other applications. So basically, there's historically been this trade-off between sensor resolution and how quickly the overpass interval is. Again, in the past couple of years, that's really changed. We've seen satellites launched by the European Space Agency. Sentinel satellites really changed this. So again, reasonably high resolution at sub-weekly intervals, and then private sector entrants in the Bay Area, Planet being the main one, getting 3-meter daily imagery. Again, those don't go back that far. Those go back 3 or 4 years now. But going forward, they're going to be this sort of amazing resource. So in our work, we use a combination of public and private imagery. The maps I showed you before are all based on public imagery, right? So that imagery, in a sense, is free. I mean, you got to be able to download it. You got to be able to crunch through it, right? That's the cost. But the imagery itself, we can acquire for free, which is great.
Thank you, Marshall. And just to continue, there was a little bit of confusion about the wealth data that you showed. There are a couple of questions on that. Do you mind elaborating on it a little bit more? Is it based
Sure.
on assumption or is it based on some actual data you've obtained?
Sure. Yeah. So for the economic indicators, we are basing these on well-vetted, nationally representative household surveys, right? And I think in the comments, folks had mentioned that these data, at least the ones in the public domain, are anonymized. And that's right. What we have is the cluster, the enumeration area level coordinates, and random noise has been added to those coordinates, right? So that's a problem we have to deal with on our side. And we've done a lot of testing, and we actually have a very nice project with Talib looking at consumption expenditure estimates and trying to understand how much better do we do using his LSMS data if we have the non-anonymized, the non-spatially jittered data. And it looks like it helps a little bit, but we actually still do a pretty good job when we use the anonymized jittered stuff. Again, we're not trying to make measurements right now at the household level. We're making predictions at the enumeration area level, right? So think about this as the village or neighborhood level. So again, from the survey, what we do is we take all the households in an EA, we average them typically to get a measure of asset wealth or a measure of consumption expenditure, and that's what we predict. For the asset wealth measure in particular, we're actually following the sort of World Bank methods cookbook on this. So we're taking households' responses to asset ownership, and we're creating an index out of that using a principal components analysis. Again, can get into the details there. You can do it in different ways. You can just add up the assets. You can do this PCA. They all give you pretty similar answers. And for the application I showed, we're using the demographic and health surveys. They have the asset measure, again, across a lot of geographies, and the data are in the public domain. So it's something we can actually train on.
Thank you, Marshall. So I think you've covered some parts of this question. It came from Malena, whose team is working on urban geospatial data. She's asking, how are you able to go to village sub-level or sub-village level data and collect that?
So on the wealth side, we're not going sub-village. The wealth side is just village level because that's what we see in the household surveys. So as folks who are not doing these surveys ourselves, we depend a lot on what's in the public domain, or we depend on partnerships with folks at the World Bank or within ministries, right, to get data to train and evaluate these models on, right? So really what's been in the public domain historically is these village level or cluster level measurements, and that's what we've historically tried to predict. That's different for agriculture. For agriculture, we've actually gone out and collected a lot of the data ourselves, or more recently, thank God, worked with the LSMS team and piggybacked on their sort of gold standard data collection on the agricultural side to make these measurements. And there at sub-village level, right, we're taking plot level measurements and then predicting outcomes at the plot level. And some of these plots are really small, right? This is smallholder agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa, and so we're able to make accurate predictions at very, very small spatial scales.
Thank you. There are two more questions, and before we sort of close this stage of Q&A, I would like to ask them, but I'll inverse them because one of them is about clustering and anonymizing GPS coordinates. So a hero is asking is that DHS and LSMS anonymize the GPS coordinates of households of hundreds of clusters, reducing the sample size. If you take the mean or median value of the same GPS coordinates of clusters, how did you manage reducing the number of samples due to GPS anonymization? And if you need to, we can get more explanation.
No, I think I'll try to answer, and if I don't answer the right question, Hero can jump in. So I think the question is, so yeah, the surveys are done at the household level. Again, we're not making predictions at the household level. We're making predictions at the village or cluster level. So we're just taking an average over the households. And so if LSMS survey has 5,000 households, it might end up having 500 clusters, right? 10 households per cluster, order of magnitude, right? That is a challenge in terms of training these models. Basically, we have then 500 observations with which to train a model. That's a challenge. So this is something we've worked really hard on. How can you come up with models that that work on relatively small training data sets? And lots of methods development that we've done over the years to again convince ourselves that can work. What's nice when you have something like the DHS or when you have LSMS across many countries is you have a lot more input data. So even when you're just looking at villages, you can look at villages, many more villages, thousands of villages at the same time, right? And then the question is Malawi similar enough to Tanzania to be able to pool those data and train models on both, right? And that's something, again, we've evaluated very carefully. And it suggests, yeah, there's enough similarity in terms of what the satellite is picking up that you can sort of pool observations and still do a good job when you test the model out of sample, when you test it on an entirely new country where it hasn't had any of that data to train. When you go to Kenya to evaluate the model after having trained on Malawi and Tanzania, it still does a pretty good job in terms of the features that it's using to make these predictions.
So,
sorry, Karen, jump in whenever. I dominated the question response here, but
Karen, did you want to add so far?
No, nothing to add, but I actually have a question about one of the questions in the chat. So I'll let you finish, and I'll hold that to the end.
Thank you. Chime in. So I see a question about how do you establish causality and behavior, assess behaviors through using geospatial, because it may not capture that. And someone is piggybacking and saying that because there are some errors of inclusion in using geographic targeting, how do you address it through your work? Do you do some ground truthing? Do you have any other methodologies for that? And I'm just saying this for the benefit of the participants. We will respond to these questions, to this last round of questions. Then we will go to Talib and to Raghavan, and then we will do another Q&A. So don't think that someone got forgotten or missed. So thank you. Karen, did you want to chime in, or Marshall?
Either. Karen, happy to, or I don't need to answer for them, but happy to.
This is a work in progress. I mean, I think that this is some of the biggest questions that we're grappling with right now. Marshall, you can talk some more about the work. And we do have a work group working on this causal inference and trying to unpack this a little bit.
Yeah, so to chime in on that, behavior is certainly hard. So you can think in the agricultural setting, we've shown that we can actually observe some management behaviors from satellites, like our farmers tilling, various management practices, right? When are they harvesting? Behaviors internal to the household that we care about, that we often try to measure in household surveys, we're never going to get those from satellites, right? So one thing we should be very clear is that satellites are going to work well for certain key outcomes. They're not going to work at all for other outcomes, right? And so our view is that satellites here are not going to replace household surveys by any means. They're really going to amplify the power of the existing household surveys that we have, right? So again, this is not a wholesale replacement. This is an amplification of the power of the existing surveys, again, helping to fill in the gaps, both temporally and spatially, of what we know about the world. In terms of errors of inclusion or exclusion, I think that's right. Any targeting technology is going to have that question. I think the question we should always have in our minds is, does this new approach using satellites, does it do better or worse than what we would have done otherwise, right? And if we don't have a survey to target with anyway, this is going to be better. We know that this gives us information, right? In a setting in which we've just had a recent household consumption expenditure survey and a census, right? This might do worse than that setting, right? But again, based on the existing data, those settings are few and far between. And so again, that's why we think, relative to what we have otherwise, this is often going to be a very useful technology.
Sorry, it took a second to unmute. Thank you, everyone. Again, let's go to Talib and then to Raghavan to hear from them, and then we'll do a longer round of Q&A, and AI is here to help us think through some of the questions that you have. And I see the questions coming, so I'm noting them as well. Talib, are you there? Should we start with your part?
Yeah.
Thank you, Talib.
Okay. Thank you, Bahar, and thank you, IAG team, for having me. My name is Talib Kılıç. I am with the Development Data Group. I'm a member of the Living Standards Measurement Study team. I'm one of the team leaders there. And for those of you that are not familiar with the LSMS, We're a household survey program. It's now 40 years old. We work in 3 tracks. We provide financial and technical assistance to national statistical offices in designing and implementing large-scale household surveys. We have a track on methodological and tool development where we are developing and validating improved survey methods for adoption in large-scale surveys. And lastly, many of us are economists, statisticians by training, so we are also heavy users of the LSMS data themselves for policy research. So in the last couple of years, one of the multi-institutional partnerships that we are supporting is the 50 by 30 initiative, which was launched in 2018 at UNGA and aims to support 50 countries between now and 2030 to improve the agricultural survey data generated as part of their national statistical system. So the initiative has 3 components: a data production component, a methods and tools development component, and a data use for policy component, each of which is headed by a different international agency. Data production being led by FAO, methods and tools development component led by us at the World Bank, and data use being led by EFAD. So as part of the methods and tools development component, I'm leading the work program on the integration of satellites and surveys for the types of applications that Marshall and Karen have talked about at length this morning, with a specific focus on high resolution crop type mapping and crop yield estimation. Next. Thank you, Joanna. So much of that work is really against the background of the importance of agriculture and rural livelihoods, particularly in small-scale production systems. We know, and we're also heavy users of survey data ourselves on crop production, cultivated area, crop yields, for a number of research topics that are central to not only understanding dynamics in the agricultural sector, but links between agriculture and other development outcomes. The recent surge in survey methodological literature have sort of unearthed this concerns for systematic measurement error in traditional survey methods that many of us have relied on for ages, that basically elicit self-reported information on crop production and area under cultivation, which obviously fuel very vibrant area of research on agriculture and its links to development outcomes. I've listed several articles there that basically point out these concerns and that make a case for more objective measurement methods that could be used on the ground, specifically for crop cutting to capture productivity measurements. And in line with that, with this line of research, there's also quite a bit of resurgence in the recent literature on the promise of satellite-based high-resolution crop yield estimation and crop type mapping, particularly in smallholder systems that are anchored in quality survey data on the ground that is used for again calibrating and validating these remote sensing models that are increasingly using more widely available high-resolution imagery, particularly after the advent of Sentinel-2 in 2016. Next. So this is just some snips of the research that really underlies some of the ideas that Marshall and Karen presented this morning. That is really around understanding the limits of satellite-based estimation and how best survey and satellite data could be combined to predict crop yields, not only at survey locations but beyond those locations and for entire regions and countries. And some of this research I contributed to, but besides me, there's a wide range of partners here, including Marshall and David at Atlas, and other collaborators. Next. So in all of this, in all of the work that has taken place, particularly in the last 5 years, there are two key barriers that we have actually identified to be able to scale up these applications, which have been validated in small scale studies. First of all, we actually don't know the required volume and methods and content of georeferenced objective microdata that we should be eliciting in surveys to be able to train those models. And secondly, we have barriers to accessing and analyzing existing georeferenced microdata that could be training those downstream remote sensing applications. Next. So with that key barriers in mind, under the 50 by 30 initiative, we have a 3-year work program to be able to address some of these to start addressing some of these shortcomings. Obviously, the work will span longer than 3 years to be able to cover more crops and more geographies. But basically, what we're trying to do is conducting research to answer open questions in microdata collection to be able to support scaling up these integrated satellite and survey applications. So in the immediate term, we're focusing on an attainable set of agricultural outcomes that have been investigated in recent research. So those are production, cultivated area, and crop yields, and with a specific focus on cereal crops, which are in a way lower hanging fruits, still tough to get vis-a-vis other crops. And in doing that, we're building on existing partnerships and joint research programs of our group as the agency responsible for this particular component of the 50 by 30 initiative. So at the end of the 3-year work program, the main output that we're working towards is this, we called it a blueprint. We called it a protocol for how much and how georeferenced microdata should be collected in all 50 by 30 supported surveys. As I mentioned, these 50 countries that will be supported by the initiative between now and basically in the next 10 years for calibrating and validating remote sensing models for crop type mapping and yield estimation. Joanna, next. This is my last slide, a brief overview of our activities in this 3-year work, which started about a year ago. As part of this work program, we competitively selected an Earth observation partner to help the LSMS team and basically our team to be able to oversee this work. We're engaged with partner national statistical offices to negotiate access to existing georeferenced data, much of which actually have been collected under the LSMS umbrella. And this existing georeference data come currently from 4 countries: Ethiopia, Malawi, Mali, and Uganda. These are existing georeferenced data, georeferenced household locations, plot outlines, coupled with crop production data that had been elicited in surveys that are supported by the LSMS. So we're going to be further validating and refining readily available technology using these existing data, but also new data from other smaller scale field experiments that we will start fielding in the new year with COVID-19 fieldwork protocols to be able to tackle some open questions we have in regards to how microdata should be collected, for instance, with a specific focus on intercrop systems. One of the ancillary, I think, outputs of all of this research will be satellite-derived data sets and maps for a minimum of 5 countries. So we started working in 4 already, with a focus on those 3 agricultural outcomes that I mentioned for 4 cereal crops to be made publicly available. Much of this work will culminate in research papers, peer-reviewed research papers that will serve as background material for this protocol that I mentioned, which we will promote for adoption among all 50 by 30 supported surveys, such that they could collect the minimum required ground data for calibration and validation purposes for downstream applications. And lastly, and not least, we will continue these discussions with legal and technological partners, together with the NSOs that we're working with, to be able to make these data accessible to the wider community with privacy protections, such that other remote sensing applications could be launched with these data, and with the satellite imagery that's either freely available or at the disposal of those users. Thank you.
This is so perfect. Every one of you is holding on to your timelines. I'm grateful to from here to the to the skies. Thank you. Before we go to the questions, and this is again for the benefit of the participants, let me turn to Raghavan to sort of connect the loop of what we've heard so far to our evaluations and how some plans that we have internally, and then we'll go to Q&A. Thank you. Raghavan, can we come to you?
Yes, thank you, Bahar. Thank you, Marshall, Karen, and Talib. Bahar, on your question, when and how we've used geospatial, took me back to the 90s when we used a Garmin GPS machine in our cars driving through the US to figure out. So we've all been users of geospatial in some way or another for many years. Bringing it down to how we've used it, just to provide some context, in the micro team, I want to recognize some of our micro team colleagues who are on the call. In my previous role working in the infrastructure sector, we've used geospatial data to look at outputs in private sector interventions, whether it's construction of roads, completion of a power plant. We looked at, in some cases, immediate outcomes. In the case of any spillover effects, highways connecting to rural roads, new communities being formed, jobs, sort of related spillover effects. So we've observed these things in sort of micro cases for several years now. Now, taking it to sort of the macro level, one of the issues that we've had is to identify the application and connecting it to the problem. Obviously, as we have a tough crowd here. Many of the questions relate to how we've used geospatial data in the past, whether it's in ag or infrastructure. But I think the challenge really is how are you using geospatial data to address a particular problem? And I'll illustrate it with the example of what I'm working on right now and what I'm discussing with Atlas. The issue really that we're tackling is in the energy efficiency sector. As many of you know, that much of the World Bank Group interventions have been focused heavily on the energy access side, which is primarily the supply side. It primarily goes into what Giuseppe called in one of his chat messages about as inputs. So these are primarily inputs. But what we are grappling with in our analysis is on the demand side of energy. So we are trying to use geospatial information with Atlas and other partners to understand the demand side. And I'll tell you one additional a layer before I pass it back to Bahar. I mean, we can go into the details. We have challenges in understanding energy efficiency at the urban side and at the rural side. We also have geospatial needs, data needs to understand energy efficiency, not just at the household level, but also at the commercial level, at the buildings level, at the industry level. So the problem definition goes towards what I call as energy poverty issue. Just building on the standard poverty indicators, but energy poverty goes beyond just energy access. It goes to understanding how the energy that's supplied, the access that consumers have, the beneficiaries have, how is it utilized, and how does it act in relation to the wealth they have. So that's an interesting problem. We're trying to push the needle here. And then the second indicator we want to look at is energy intensity. What are the types of activities that are using up the energy access that they've been supplied, and how far is it going beyond the household, beyond the residential sector into the industry sector. I also want to recognize quickly Hiro, Yokoi, who's working with us on this. I'm happy to elaborate a bit more, Bahar, but I'll pass it back to you and let you drive the discussion. Okay, I don't see her. Okay, we may have lost her because of the weather. Okay, let me continue just to provide a little bit more insights on the problem we are tackling with. So we've talked a little bit about the LSMS surveys, what kind of data they can provide us. So a lot of that falls into the input side of things. We know the World Bank has done some tremendous work with the LSMS. Of course, Talib's work is very useful. They're all inputs for us. On the energy sector specifically, where we are trying to move the needle is on the World Bank's multi-tier framework survey. As many of you know, it's a highly used survey data with results for energy access. So those would all form the inputs. And what we are trying to get at is the level of intensity that we can measure and estimate, maybe some predictive model based on the wealth data, based on the energy consumption data, based on the energy access data. To what extent have the World Bank Group interventions been able to reduce intensity? Of course, controlling for errors of commission and errors of omission. But that's a very interesting question to ask. And as some of you might know, as the more energy you supply to households and industries, there tends to be, what economists call a rebound effect. What that means is just because a household has more access doesn't mean they'll use less. If you put energy efficiency bulbs and other cooling or heating solutions, they actually tend to use more. So we want to understand a little bit more about the gridded energy intensity, the energy poverty levels, and also a little bit on the rebound effects. And we feel to tackle this problem, geospatial information would be one of the many different methodologies that we would deploy. Using Talib's work on LSMS and using Marshall and Karen's tools, we hope to pursue a little bit on the evaluation side of things. Now, very quickly going into the different criteria, I'm pretty confident that some of the relevance aspect can be answered. The relevance criteria can be answered by geospatial information. Urban, rural, frontier region, non-frontier region, middle income, up. So that's pretty standard. So we already know how the relevance criteria could be answered. The effectiveness criteria that we all love and talk about on the outcome side, I think it's really sector dependent. It really depends on the problem that you're trying to answer. And then if we don't have a good problem definition, I think we would go down this rabbit hole of choosing something cool, but it might not get us the answer. So that would be the word of caution from my side, that geospatial, I think as Marshall rightly said, it's not going to answer all the evaluation questions or all the evaluation criteria that you have. You really need to, I mean, at least in my experience, I'm a member of the Coalition of Geospatial Organizations. I've worked on geospatial, even my previous job before the World Bank Group for the oil and gas industry. It really depends on what problem we're trying to address and how the methodology needs to be tweaked and where the entry points are for somebody like Atlas. So I think Bahar is back. I'm going to pass the floor back to her, and we can talk a little bit more about what we do in infrastructure.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, we had a internet outage, but I'm back, and thank you for leading this. I'm assuming that we're responding to questions right now because Raghavan just completed his presentation. Is that correct?
I didn't have a PowerPoint, but I walked through how we plan to utilize geospatial in upcoming work and recognize some of the work we've done in the micro products before.
Perfect. So there were a series of questions before, and we can cluster them, but we can also hear from all of you, Talib included, and Ragavan, based on the experiences. And if anyone wants to put more questions on the chat, please do so, or raise your hand if you want to voice some of your experiences, or clarify something that you may need clarification on. We have about 20 minutes to do this, and then we'll go to yours for his closing remarks. So we have some time to discuss, but one of the things that were discussed before, or asked, sorry, not discussed, is I guess this whole side of human, how do you account for behaviors, and again, human side of HHS surveys and data collection? Do you do some kind of cautionary data collection there, or do you do some additional supplemental data collection to address the issues of not getting the human side of this kind of work? So let's start with this question.
I can answer from the Atlas perspective. Yeah, so again, maybe I don't fully understand the question, but we're using the existing survey measures on key outcomes that we that are in these surveys all the time. So think of these as the LSMS consumption expenditure surveys, right? They do a very long enumeration of all the things I've bought or consumed in the last year. We add that up, we have one measure, and then we're just trying to predict that measure. So in that sense, we're very much just, in a sense, replicating what's already in the survey information. Maybe one of your points, and this is sort of something we definitely worry about, is so what is the satellite picking up, right? And this, I think, relates to one of the other questions, like how do these models actually work, right? So it's useful to think about that. So we have a ground-based measure that's georeferenced. Let's say it's a village level measure of consumption expenditure or asset wealth, like I talked about. Okay, so we're going to predict that with the satellite. The models we use here range from the pretty simple to the very complex. And the complex ones tend to, if you have enough data, provide better predictions. And here we're actually using techniques and model architectures from computer science that were developed in a very different domain. They were developed in the image recognition domain. So if you look at two photographs that have been taken, dog versus cat, hamster versus weasel, right? We've gotten very good at training computers to tell the differences between those two things. And this is a set of model architectures called neural networks or convolutional neural networks. So our idea was, can we take that architecture and actually apply it to satellite imagery and learn features, or learn features being just useful predictive parts of images to predict something we actually
I think we lost Marshall there.
Yeah, it's definitely
lost
weather interfering with internet, but that's okay. Karen, did you want to maybe continue, or we can hear from someone else?
Yeah, I mean, I can follow up just a little bit too. I mean, I can't get into the technical details, but that point that Marshall said, that question of like, what exactly are the satellites picking up, and what are the images that are being recognized, and then therefore like the assumptions that are being made, and that's like this unknown science. And it's so funny because I asked that Marshall when I started here about 6 months. I think I was paying Marshall like every week. Like, I don't really get it. Like, what exactly are they seeing? And then like, how are they making these inferences? And the answer is we don't exactly know just yet. So I think that that's part of like this existing future of like, what can we learn from this to complement this space of M&E and evaluations. And then the other kind of piece that I see as very parallel to that is that, as we all know, like, we impose our own logic and our own reasonings on everything from our logic models to our frames to the data that we're asking from people and how we're interpreting that data. And then again, I think it's just thinking kind of blue sky and what the power of these technologies are, is that when we can come and start to look at like ecosystems, looking from different perspectives and starting to understand of like what we call like our verticals in combination, or these insights at the intersection. That's really interesting, because a lot of us, when we go and if we're working on an ag project, we're thinking about agriculture systems, and we might have our imposition of what some other things are that are having influence on these systems, but we're looking at this system with that particular framework, and then starting to expand that so we can incorporate what else is happening in the ecosystem. Just kind of goes to the potential power of this.
If I can just add on to that, I think it's a very important and interesting question about human behavior and GIS data. But I think there's a lot of research that's still ongoing. Two examples that I would point out is there are some think tanks and research organizations looking at micro mobility data to see how, it's almost like a transport sector survey. Imagine an LSMS for transport, right? So they're trying to figure out, how human behavior is reflected or inferred through the micro mobility data, through how they transport and how they move from one location to another within a city, within an urban setting, within a public space, even depending on the problem you're trying to answer. So I think as we get into sort of this nexus of behavior and GIS, we'll also have to obviously expand the input side, the data sets that we use. And I think there's a lot out there, but again, selectively using it, having a strong logic about why we're using it, I think that's going to be key. But I would suggest for those who are interested in that space is watch out for this micro mobility transport data points that will give some level of inputs and comfort to those who are trying to understand micro behavior.
Thank you, Raghavan. I see Marshall is back. Karen did a really good job filling in. So
Sorry, yeah, internet went away.
Yeah, the hurricane is messing with the plans.
Even on the West Coast, yeah.
Exactly. Ours is like the calamity is fires.
So one other question I'm going to ask, I also see Victor Vergara, who is working with another person, Malena, who posted earlier, has some feedback. And Victor, I'll ask you maybe to voice your experience that you're posting about GEMS in a second. But one question that came from Elena earlier, and I don't want to miss it, I would like to pose to all of you, and I don't know who would want to address it. Are there any measures of robustness for what is better or worse in doing this work, in collecting this type of data? Do you have any standards or measures to say, to sort of compare against golden standards, I guess? And Elena, I don't know if you're still online or not. If I'm not translating your question correctly, please chime in.
Tully, if you want to take that one on the ag side, I think that's where we actually have the best evidence.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'll do that. Thanks, Elena. Also, hi. Thanks for the question. Okay, so I think much of this recent research has really focused on validating remote sensing models that could be applied to satellite imagery. And by validation, I mean having gold standard ground-based measures in place when we're working in, say, outcomes specific to agriculture. So for crop yields, that would be a well-supervised a crop cutting operation that would be implemented in parallel on the ground for the same plot locations for which you acquire satellite imagery. So we have some work that actually showcases the degree to which satellite-based models perform vis-a-vis, gold standard measurements. In that particular case, full plot crop cuts, and we have some very promising results there, but also some areas for future work that we're now tackling under the 50 by 30 initiative. In general, I would say that, you know, like your question is very important. Your question also, I think, points the importance of validating these applications very rigorously. Like in my experience in this field, which is a very, very crowded one, the point about validation is often lost or not talked about. I think there's a lot of hype about satellite imagery, the new techniques, but not as critical of a discussion on what is good enough. And I think that's one of the things that I appreciated, well, from long before even Atlas AI, and working with Marshall and David. You know, their focus on you know, peer-reviewed scientific research, and basically the intersection point between them and us on how good ground data from, you know, from surveys could be used to validate and calibrate these models that bring the two worlds together. Because yeah, this kind of attention, I think, to validation and use of, you know, peer-reviewed techniques is quite heterogeneous in this space. So.
Talib, since I have you, and before I turn over to Victor for some of his insights, can I ask a question about LSMS that came specifically for you, for Joachim?
Yeah.
So Joachim is asking about LSMS, which is a
Yeah.
national representative data to estimate poverty levels. Then using LSMS data to calibrate geospatial models with national scope requires that LSMS is representative for agricultural production in different agroecological zones at a granular level. What are some challenges do you see with this method or approach?
Yeah.
And I think it ties to our prep discussion. What are some risks, right?
Okay. Yeah. So thanks, Joachim. Also, hi. Thanks for the question. Okay. So you know, LSMS surveys, or, you know, typical national farm surveys, they're implemented for a very specific, you know, purposes. So they're not implemented as ground data generation operations to be able to inform these remote sensing applications. So their sampling design, you know, first and foremost, they're put in place to do X, Y, and Z, and that's not necessarily remote sensing. So what we're trying to do is obviously a typical LSMS with those broader objectives will not lend itself to doing remote sensing analysis for every outcome, because we're not going to be powered sufficiently to be able to capture rare crops, rare outcomes in the population for which you would need an oversample. So your question really, the answer to your question really differs based on what kind of crop, what kind of analysis we could do with the LSMS data from the ground. So as Marshall said, you know, like he said, for the moment, they're focused on maize. You know, they have a heavy focus on maize. Well, you know, the work that we're doing with the existing data, that also have a focus on maize, because that's the strength of the ground data. So because that's something that you always have to keep in mind, the purpose of ground data collection, whether it's sufficient enough to be able to calibrate a model, because for some crops, we will not do a fine job. Like working in Malawi, thinking about rice mapping, LSMS will not be generating sufficient data points to capture rice plots, because it is relatively a rare event, say within that agricultural population, for which you would need to commission a very specific effort. So there are also limits to what you can do through this integration process as a function of how ambitious your objective is and the sampling design you have in place.
I mean, if I could come in on how we would see it on an evaluation perspective. Very briefly, I think there are 3 or 4 principles that we have to keep in mind when we look at the risks with GIS data. One is obviously the precision of the data and to what extent that it's the horizontal, vertical positioning and the data you gather. It's all about precision there. and sort of what we call positional risk, right? A second would be what we, I think, talked about through the questions and answers earlier in the previous round, which is the attributable risk. When we talk about household information person, then you have other sub-factors like gender, age, income, occupation, education, and many other characteristics that drive a certain behavior on the output side of things. So what I would call as the attributable risk. Then you have the conceptual risk, where a lot of effort is still required in reducing the abstraction and classification of what you would see in the real world versus what you would see thousands of miles away from a camera, right? So, I mean, this it's very applicable in the energy sector, at least, where the effectiveness of the GIS data and how we manage utilities based on that, it's a very hard link to make, but I think people are trying. So there's a conceptual risk there. And to a certain degree, the fourth and the last category in my mind would be what I call the sort of the logical risk, where what you're comparing the GIS data with, what are you benchmarking it against, what information is stored in the geospatial data, and how are you extracting that. So to me, there is positional risk, attribution, conceptual, and logical. That's the way I would see it more broad.
Thank you, Raghavan, and thank you, Talib. This was great. Victor, you wanted to share some experiences you've had with your team. Do you want to quickly bring those up before the
Sure.
next round?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's basically the last point Raghavan mentioned, which I think is a deal breaker. It's basically if you don't have basic information, you can kiss everything goodbye. I mean, you can't get started. So the World Bank does not have a protocol to locate investments in latitude and longitude. It only does so from a jurisdictional perspective, saying at the city or regional level. So what this does is basically it does not enable the identification of places where the bank is having an impact. And this is a serious constraint. This is being addressed to a great extent with the GEMS, with this the platform that is being used in FCD countries to monitor projects using smartphones and geotagging with coordinates. But I think I think we need to, before we talk about fancy things, we need to talk about the basics. The bank needs to do that, and it needs to be on a recurrent basis, not just at the project design level, but more importantly at the supervision level. So the ISRs every year should list the projects and investments that are taking place, so that you can have a baseline, so that you can monitor it at project closure, and more importantly down the road for impact evaluation. So I'm afraid that we have some basic things to fix before we talk about fancier things to make a big impact. Clearly, there's lots to do. There's lots we can do, and we're trying to do things. This is what Malena explained in the Managing Urban Spatial Growth Evaluation. But we could do much more if we had the data from the bank's investments. So that's it from here. Thanks.
Thank you, Victor. Any reactions to this point from the presenters?
I mean, if I can just piggyback on Victor's point, I think I wanted to recognize Stefan Wegner, who was on the call earlier, but he may have just left. I think one of the evaluations on World Bank's approach to digital development or digital transformation for like corporate use, for internal use, I think this would be a fantastic case study, could be a fantastic case study to show where a framework is really required on how we would draw the boundaries, how we would assess age of certain geospatial data. We talk about it at the World Bank Group, but we don't have a sort of a thinking framework around it. But that would be a place, great place for IAG to talk about it, in addition to all the things Victor said.
Thank you. Anyone else before I ask a final couple questions, reactions to what we just heard?
I totally agree, Raghavan and Victor. This seems really important. I guess our view at Atlas is that there are some interventions out there, either done by the World Bank or done by others, where we do already have information on where and when the intervention went in. But you're absolutely right that how can you do an evaluation at all, even with the fanciest outcome measures, if you don't know where the intervention happened? So 100% agree. We want to be ready for when those data are collected. We can, then spin up an evaluation pretty quickly, right? And so we're trying to be ready on the outcome side, such that when a project does have, the right kind of intervention information, then we can do the analysis that we want to. But I totally agree that constraint needs to be solved too.
Bahar, I wanted to just add 1 minute to this. Yeah. So it seems that in my experience, at least with the operational projects at the bank, there's actually quite a bit of heterogeneity in the attention that is paid to basically collecting metadata about project implementation in a spatially explicit way. So I think there's a huge scope for this. Given now, many technologies at our disposal, and yet we don't have this systematic approach to how spatially explicit information should be elicited in World Bank interventions. The protocol that I mentioned, I guess, for household surveys, we could think about a similar protocol in basically different sectoral applications. So it doesn't to me, this is another type of a public good. It's an internal looking public good perhaps, but many of these World Bank projects have a public good nature themselves. So downstream users of project implementation data would greatly benefit from that. So it seems that there's that need for such protocol also in the project implementation space, which I don't know who within the bank should lead that discussion, but it sounds like we have many units working in kind of spaces that would have synergistic links. And we ought to be coming together and addressing this particular problem.
Thank you, Talib. Sounds like a plea to have some changes in our project frameworks and paths.
Bahar,
Go ahead, Karen.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I just also wanted to add, Victor, I'm very glad that you brought that up, because that was actually the question that came through earlier in the chat from Ebru that I wanted to address later on, that you need to know the exact location of interventions, and it's not always available. I mean, it's evident here. This was like key learning #1 with our experience with the government in Kenya. So you guys are struggling with it. Governments are struggling with it, and that's kind of one of these key themes I see across a lot of these different relationships is structuring that essentially comes down to the design correct from the beginning to leverage technologies like this.
Thank you so much, Karen. Thank you. And there was a question from Leonardo Bravo, and I think he may have left, or maybe he's here, I just don't see him on the list, about machine learning and how you use some of these quick data analysis techniques, such as machine learning, again, in analyzing your geospatial data or supplementing it. And it could be Atlas or Talib or Raghavan, whoever wants to take the question.
I can just mention on the Atlas side. Yeah, I mean, no, that's the key sort of backbone. I think I cut out right before I was going to explain what these models did, which I won't go into detail, but these machine learning architectures that have come out of the computer vision domain in computer science are really the backbone of how we make sense of satellite imagery and extract useful information, right? So yeah, we fundamentally depend on machine learning for helping us understand satellite images. So it's key.
You're asking for the secret sauce, Marshall.
Oh, I'll send you our papers. A lot of it's not secret; it's published. So I'll send you the boring papers if you want to do a deep dive.
We do. I think we have some people who are very interested in the subject matter, and if you have any interesting insights and willing to share with the IEG team, that would be great on how you incorporate machine learning. Thank you. And
actually, they're
Leonardo.
all on our website. Everybody can get them right now. They're all on the website under Learn. We try to put all of our publications up there until we get our hands slapped. We're going to keep doing it.
That's so great. Thank you. I see Leonardo is here and he says, yes, please. So we'll dig through your website too. Thank you. Raghavan, I thought you were going to chime in before we cut off.
No, I think the floor is yours, probably. I think there's a lot to talk about, but let's hear from the Oracle.
Jos, are you ready to give us some of your closing remarks and maybe some insights?
Thank you, esteemed colleagues. I will put up one slide simply to avoid having my face large screen on your screens.
Now I know a good technique.
Yes, exactly. Already it's happening now, and sharing doesn't work. Oh, yeah, it's working. One moment, please. Sorry, my computer is a bit slow.
It's okay. I think it's starting. The content is sharing.
Do you see it?
Not yet. It says it's starting to share. Now we see it.
All right. Esteemed colleagues, thank you very much for interesting presentations and discussion, both from Karen and Marshall, from Philippe, and also from Raghavan. Let me try to make a few remarks from the perspective of using geospatial data in the evaluation realm. So I think many of the people in the audience are very familiar with the topic already. So I will keep introductory comments short, but I think it's important to understand geospatial data are not new in the world of evaluation. What has really changed is that data are becoming increasingly available, open access satellite imagery data, as Karen showed. The field of data science is evolving, so we can now use machine learning algorithms to assign meaning to imagery data, and we have a lot more computing capacity available to do the necessary analysis. So potentially we have a new treasure trove of geospatial data available to us. So this potential includes, among other things, as discussed today, that we can now use geospatial data more widely to capture phenomena of interest to evaluators, like the evolution of poverty levels at quite granular levels. We can use other data collection tools, such as surveys, to ground truth and also to train machine learning algorithms on imagery data to help us predict things of interest, like crop yields and poverty levels at scale. So that's very interesting. And also something that Karen and Marshall mentioned, we can use data layering options much more frequently. So we can, for example, overlay data on in a particular region on flood risks with presence of infrastructure and also with land use patterns. And then we can better understand where is, for example, the highest need for infrastructure investments to strengthen resilience against floods. So there's a lot of potential, and this potential is also present for us as evaluators in order to respond better to our evaluation questions. So Raghavan referred to this already when referring to the evaluation criteria. So talking about the criterion of relevance, we can use geospatial data to look at the spatial distribution of specific phenomena and then compare it with the spatial targeting of development interventions. Or to summarize, are the investments going where the need is highest? So are poverty alleviation initiatives going to areas where there are the highest poverty incidence levels? We did it a little bit in the Mexico country program evaluation, where we looked at World Bank Group investment data, geospatial data. We looked at public treasury data from Mexico and overlapped that with geospatial data on incidence of poverty levels. It was not a very granular analysis, but there is potential to do this stuff more. Secondly, is the effectiveness question, and there was quite some discussion on this. So how can we look at geospatial data on proxies of outcome variables of interest to us over time, such as, for example, land use changes and or geospatial poverty estimates, And how can we use, for example, spatial counterfactual designs and or various types of statistical modeling to assess the impact of particular interventions in the area of interest. So that type of exercise, geospatial impact evaluation, is becoming accessible to us. It's becoming more cost effective for us to do this, and we have done it in a few instances. There's Hiro's work with Victor and Malena on Maputo and Mumbai on road improvements. There's Joachim's work on Madagascar and deforestation. There's Bekele's work on sustainable land management practices in Ethiopia. So there's quite a bit of potential to do more of this. Then the third criterion would be sustainability. And we haven't really looked at this in detail, but we can actually use geospatial data over much longer time spans to assess the sustainability of effects of particular interventions. And this would be very interesting to explore a little bit further. We can look at phenomena such as deforestation or infrastructure maintenance, for example, over longer time spans and related to particular large-scale investments that were supported by the World Bank. So there's a lot of potential from an evaluation questions perspective, but there are also many, many challenges. Several methodological challenges were discussed. Joachim and Hiro raised some in the chat. Also, the speakers raised a number. I'm just going to talk very briefly about three challenges that came also up in the discussion, or at least two of them. One is the challenge of georeferencing, and Victor made a very clear point, and I fully agree. There is really a problem of having geo-tagged data on where World Bank Group investments are going. So we have on the one hand things like GEMS that provide very granular data on where the money is going, but this is very patchy in terms of coverage. And then we have these large-scale data where through machine learning we scan through our paths to see where World Bank Group investments are going, but both are inadequate. We don't have full coverage georeference data on where the money is going, and that's an issue. Not just World Bank Group money, but also public investment from government and also from other partners. We need that to better understand evaluative issues of impact and relevance. So that's a core issue. Secondly, that was also discussed by, I think, Marshall and Talib, who referred to the fact, okay, there is a treasure trove of data embedded in World Bank projects, but there's no real incentive in operations to build geospatial data collection frameworks into project designs. So of course, our esteemed colleagues from DEC are doing very nice things with our colleagues in operations, but there's no general incentive to do this better. And we as evaluators, apart from pointing this out in evaluation reports, are also not directly connected to the intervention cycle. So how can we incentivize our colleagues in operations to make more informed investments about geospatial data collection at the outset of the project would be an interesting question. And finally, there's also the challenge for evaluators ourselves. So how can we do more informed geospatial data analysis and evaluation, for example, on IG? So how can we think about more structurally about incentives for doing this type of work? How can we build our staff capacities? How do we develop the right partnerships? How do we deal with some of the methodological challenges? And how do we get a better idea of the cost-benefit relationships of doing certain exercises? So these are questions that I just want to throw out, and you're all aware of them. I don't have all the answers to these questions, but we are currently working with a small group, a data science working group in IAG with 9 fantastic colleagues, and we are thinking about these questions, and hopefully we have something of an answer in a couple of months that will help us go forward. But I will leave it to this. Thank you very much for interesting presentations, and over to you again.
Thank you, Jos. You left us with lots of good and interesting questions that I'm sure all of us will go back and try to come back again with some, hopefully interesting answers and experiments. So this is not last of, I'm sure this is not last of a series, and we'll hear from everyone from Atlas, hopefully, and from the colleagues who are online, and what are some interesting progress that we've made in this field, because it's a growing field and it's something that we need. I just, on my behalf, and I wanted to thank everyone who presented today. Jos, thank you for excellent closing remarks. Presenters, thank you for your time, not just presenting, but also prepping and exchanging emails and thinking through what could be relevant. And thank you to the participants for staying on and asking really good questions and being genuinely engaged. It's always a little bit nerve-wracking to know, will people be engaged or not? So thank you. This was excellent. We will have the recording. I got several messages with questions. We will have this recorded and we will post it on our internal website with some lessons and takeaways write-up like we've done for previous BBLs. And Karen very kindly shared her email address here with a link to the website and said if you have any questions, we can refer to her for future. So we'll share that as well when we share the recording. With this, thank you very much. Have a wonderful day. Hopefully this weather in the East Coast will not get in too much in our way of having weekend, but thank you. I appreciate everybody's time.